let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
This is so awesome.
We are an open culture that believes in
What is that process that a developer, or let's say,
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed?
Hi, and welcome to another episode of In the Clouds. I am your host, Stu Miniman. It is the end of September. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're switching over to fall. Where I'm sitting, it's a little bit rainy today and starting to watch some of the leaves turn color and drop. And in the fall, tend to get, the slate of second half of the year conferences. One of them we're going to talk a little bit about today is, of course, KubeCon and Cloud Native Con. That event is happening the second week of November in Atlanta. We're going to throw in the chat the link for all of the Red Hat activity. Of course, as always, we have a Day Zero event on that Monday, which is OpenShift Commons. It is free to attend. We have a phenomenal slate of users that will be sharing their stories about how they're using and participating in the cloud native ecosystem, as well as we've got a big presence at the show itself. Happy to welcome to the guest for this episode, somebody I've known for many years through the early days of cloud, into cloud native, open source, and everything. Randy Bias. He is the Vice President of Strategy and Technology at Mirantis. Randy, thank you for joining us. You're currently in the Philippines, and it's you and I caught up at the KubeCon show in London, and thanks for joining me today.
I'm super happy to be here, Stu.
All right. So Randy, maybe just, for our audience, not everybody might not know you. There's certain people in the community I know that were like, hey, where is Randy these days? Because in the early days of cloud, you were a pretty vocal proponent of some of the items happening, have, pretty strong opinions as to how the technology should go. What have you been up to the last few years?
Well, I did this crazy kind of sojourn for a while. I took a little break from tech and I went to the Philippines and I opened up a fitness resort. I determined that I am much better at tech than being in hospitality. So I returned to tech. And in that process, I got involved with Mirantis, who I used to compete with in the OpenStack days. And so I've been at Mirantis for the last year and a half, basically rebooting kind of the way that they think about and do open source. And then now I've got some new projects I'm working on for them around agentic AI.
Yeah, awesome. Randy, it's obviously, we know the only constant in our industry is change. And the cloud era created a lot of change. AI is creating even more change at an even faster pace. Wonder if we could talk a little bit about, since, KubeCon, the cloud native ecosystem, Kubernetes, there's, hundreds of projects floating around there. What's your take on, where we are today, the discussion of kind of public cloud, private cloud, and that ecosystem? How do you look at that? How do you help customers understand how they should be looking at architecting their environments today?
Kubernetes environments.
Well, Kubernetes as a piece of that, but yeah, when do you use Kubernetes? Does Kubernetes for all applications?
I mean, it seems like it's all Kubernetes all the time now. I was talking to one of our customers, which is a Nordic bank, and they had 400 apps running on top of Kubernetes. And I said, how many of those are, really truly cloud native? And they said it was only about 25%. So it seems like Kubernetes has become this thing where it has won because it has both become a de facto standard, but also because it's a place where kind of developers and operators can meet in the middle, is the way I like to think about it. It kind of reminds me in some ways of like WebLogic or WebSphere, because back in the day you would have Java apps and there was a place there where developers and operators could meet in the middle. They were both comfortable with WebSphere and WebLogic and how it worked. And so Kubernetes feels like it's very, very similar in that regard. It's a place where maybe the developers aren't as happy with it as they'd like to be. Maybe the operators aren't, but it allows them both to functionally understand how the apps are going to be deployed and run and scaled and managed.
Yeah, it's the whole DevOps discussion, or in the cloud native ecosystem, a lot of discussion these days about platform engineering and where that fits into it. Obviously, developers don't want to think about their infrastructure. Operators, have struggled over many years trying to understand the needs of the developers and meet what they have. So, it'd be nice to have a perfect environment where everything worked well for everyone. Kubernetes, the community, works on things a lot. You've got these different constituents out there. So yeah, I mean, any thoughts you have on just like, where are we making good progress? Where is there still some, gaps that we need to fill?
So I was, my OpenStack company was acquired by EMC back in 2014. And then I was at Juniper for a while. And I wasn't really paying attention to Kubernetes until possibly the last year and a half, where I started to spend tons of time with it at Mirantis. So I've kind of been coming up to speed. And it's funny because I'm usually one of the early adopters. And in this case, I'm a super late adopter for Kubernetes. And so I kind of come at it with a pretty clear-eyed view. And the way that I look at it is, it feels pretty like the things that make it great are the things that also are kind of problematic, right? It started off with this idea, and I think part of the reason why it blew by OpenStack was that it kind of had an opinion. If you have a cloud native app, it goes into these pods which are horizontally scalable, and you've got eventual consistency in terms of the configuration. So you got these reconciliation loops, and it was all very much in that all the cloud native design patterns, all the Googleisms, right? But then everybody kind of came to the party and tried to create lots of optionality. So you've got 10 or 15 different networking options, and same number of storage options. And you look at something like Istio, and it can be deployed in 3 or 4 different ways, as sidecars, as ambient, and so like the whole kind of ecosystem and the technology has become very complex. And it's kind of moved away from what I would say is an opinionated approach to kind of a less opinionated approach. Like I remember when they put out what's called stateful sets now, but they first started to call pet sets. And I was like, wow, they really are going to try to run relational databases on top of Kubernetes. I mean, it just seemed like a weird kind of pattern, but you got to have some give and take. But I think, the complexity just creates some challenges, right? Like I've been using Kubernetes a lot over the last 6 months, and sometimes troubleshooting is crazy. It's got a lot of sharp edges, and a lot of complexity that I was surprised by. But on the other hand, sometimes the best tool is the one that everybody uses because everybody's familiar with it. So I think in that regard, Kubernetes is fantastic. What can be done better? Simplification. We will of course put some abstracts on top of it. You can look at Cordant, our project that we put out for multi-cloud, multi-cluster management at Mirantis, K0RDENT, and that's like a abstraction layer on top of Kubernetes to make it easier to deploy, manage, and scale, particularly for platform engineers. But I would say that that's mostly where the good and the bad.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting stuff. Yeah, think back to the days of OpenStack. That balance of opinionated versus flexibility. There was a lot of pushback when we had kind of the big tent in OpenStack, and it became almost too rigid because these were all of the pieces, integrating them all together, as opposed to a much more modular approach that the way things do in KubeCon. It was really interesting. If we look at the CNCF itself, one of the leaders from what used to be the OpenStack community, the Open Infra now, Jonathan, is now one of the leaders at CNCF. I'm curious, your thoughts on, just kind of the foundations, some of the people specifically involved in here. What did we learn from the OpenStack era, and, how does that fit with, today's open source ecosystem?
It's an interesting question. in some ways, I think that the Linux Foundation and all of its sub foundations might mimic the Kubernetes ecosystem, in that it's gotten fairly complex. And there seems to be the maturity of the Linux Foundation to build and run additional foundations is very high, but the maturity level of each of the sub foundations can vary a lot. And the size and breadth and number of participants, right? So you'll see sub foundations of Linux Foundation that, are just kind of corporate, landing spots. Kind of reminds me of the web services working groups that you used to see back in the day in the early 2000s. But then you've got ecosystems like the CNCF, which are just really well run, are very mature as a community. And I, Jonathan is an outstanding leader. He's incredibly good at sort of working with people and working through issues, and he's always asking questions, and he's very good at that open source style collaborative group consensus kind of work. So he really does a fabulous job at that. So I think that he is a great addition to the CNCF because it's complex and it's got a complex ecosystem. It's got a complex ecosystem like OpenStack had, but in a different way. And it depends on that complex ecosystem. All that optionality, all that choice is one of its strengths.
Great. Appreciate the insight. So Randy, I titled this session Pets, Cattle, and Robots. So in case some of our audience doesn't know, you came up with the awesome analogy that has probably been used, more times than we can count. You got acquired by EMC. I used to work at EMC also. When I think about how infrastructure was built for the enterprise, it was, extra power supplies, have everything I need to be able to recover, have somebody swap out boards and everything. And we would name our servers. We treated them like pets, as opposed to when you looked at cloud architecture, you bring it in a rack at the time. If things got sick, you eventually throw it in a wood chipper. So you called it like cattle's. Pets versus cattle, really good way to look at things is, do I harden the infrastructure or do I build things at a software layer, is architecturally how I think about things. AI is changing everything. So what does the addition to AI to how we think about these, how does this change the environment?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I'm still trying to get my arms around it, but it's a weird situation because on one hand, AI is really the culmination of a whole bunch of automation that we put together in the past. It really takes at the software level, all of the notions that were in cloud native to the next level, right? You're depending on software to do even more to help you run systems. You're going to see lots of work around AI ops, for example, to even more fully automate the system so that it's easier to architect in that cloud native way. But then on the other hand, you've got these other parts of AI, like the GPU as a service or GPU, power plants. And those are very much like supercomputers or mainframes. They need InfiniBand. They need to basically aggregate a bunch of GPUs and memory and make them look like one single unified system, performance computing systems of the past. So it's and much more dependent on metal, much more of a tight coupling with the actual hardware type in the vendors itself, right? NVIDIA is still the 800-pound gorilla. I think it's really interesting that, all the hyperscalers went to all of this effort to build these scale out, disaggregated, white box, open source based systems. And then here we are starting to build these gigantic GPU systems that are all tightly tied to one specific vendor's hardware, one specific vendor's software stack that runs on top of that hardware. And so we seem to be going in kind of two different directions at once in those terms. So it's, AI is kind of changing a lot of how we think about things. I even just like when you look at the agents, functionally what an agent is a piece of software where you've taken the business logic out of it and you allow an external LLM to be the business logic, right? It's just making queries to the LLM with context, bringing back what the LLM tells it to do, invoking any tools, sending it back. And normally we'd have discrete, procedural business logic there, and that's going away in term for as far as the agents are concerned. And so that opens up all kinds of possibilities, and it opens up all kinds of threats. And it means that some of these design patterns are going to be really, really interesting. And I think we're still at the beginning, like I'd call it 2009, 2010 of the cloud era. So people still don't know what AI native looks like. They know what cloud native looks like well at this point, but they don't know what AI native looks like.
Yeah, I totally would agree that we're in the early innings of what's going on here. Right, the pattern for cloud was I could actually get started really quickly. It was really inexpensive, so I could try and fail things. As opposed to in the AI world, things are really pretty expensive. When you think about cloud startups could get started with a couple of $1 million, and now you see, companies that are doing billions of dollars worth of revenue like OpenAI, but they're not profitable, or the amount of money that's being thrown into infrastructure by all the providers. One of the things we've seen, architecturally, is all the work in the cloud native ecosystem is still the underpinning for what's happening. So, one of the
100%.
questions is
Yeah.
like, hey, do containers and Kubernetes still make sense in an AI world? And everything we see is yes. There's work still to be done to make that work even better. There's a lot of groups happening at the CNCF, and some of the more interesting stuff like, Kserve and many of the other projects that are working on it. Or you talked about, the software stack and being on a, how hardened does it get to single devices? We're part of a group called LLMD, which, how do we do distributed across multiple environments, similar to what we've been doing with Linux and with hybrid cloud. So it's interesting to watch how fast things are changing, and that still, if we say, hey, what will things look like in a year or two, we still have a lot to figure out. You gave a keynote about MLOps, at the London show. How do you help customers balance things? The discussion I used to always have was, hey, it would have been great if you could start a year ago, but you didn't, so start now. These days, it's always like, hey, if you could wait another 6 months, things will be cheaper. You'll have more optionality, but you need to get started now. And how do you make sure you don't get started on something that 3 months from now is going to be obsolete?
Yeah, again, that's why I think it's like 2009, 2010, before we even had the term cloud native. The patterns aren't clear, and there is risk in starting now, but at the same time, you're balancing the risk of things changing as you are starting to deploy AI solutions with the risk of not moving ahead of your peers and being behind the ball. And I think that just like with cloud native, you've got to start getting out there, and you've got to start deploying and learning, how to use AI apps, especially agentic AI apps, in a way that's useful and for your business. And people are still at the very beginning of this, right? Like they're figuring out prompt and context engineering. They're figuring out the basics. What's a tool? What's an agent? What really is an agent? Even myself, when I was working on my first kind of agentic, project, kind of as a way to kind of teach myself, I started doing what I would say I was using agents wrong. I was building them wrong. And I was looking at things like MCP, Model Context Protocol, as sort of cure-alls, and they weren't. It needs to be deployed and used in a certain kind of way. And I got into, building up data and RAG for vector databases. And again, it was something where first time I did it, I got bad garbage. And so there's like all of this learning that we're doing as a group right now that's like in those early cloud days. What is a circuit breaker? Why do you need a circuit breaker? What's it for? How do you, which parts of your app stack do you put it in between, and which do you not? And so I think that we have a long, long way to go. And what's happening is, it seems like what's happening is we've got this early adoption within the enterprise for kind of the white collar knowledge workers. So developers, sales and marketing teams, so on. And they're using it for the things that they can get immediate business value from. And that's great. But if you're like a healthcare company, right, you want to figure out how to leverage the data that you have that's unique to you to empower your business to have greater competitive advantage in the healthcare industry. And that probably means electronic healthcare records or something like that. And that's a piece of data that's very high sensitivity that you don't want to connect to, OpenAI or Anthropic or any of the other external LLMs. That's something where you're not sure you can control it. You're not sure you can get the guarantees you need. Data leakage would cause a real problem with trust and reputational issues for you, and it would probably kill all of your AI efforts, stillborn. So what do you got to do? Somehow you have to figure out how to get like LLMs and inferent or different kinds of AI models on-prem at a reasonable cost. And it's too hard to get that hardware right now. And you need to put them in proximity to that kind of higher sensitivity data, electronic healthcare records. And then you need to build up agentic frameworks and possibly do post-training on that actual data set so that you can create LLMs that are designed for that data set and agents that know how to operate on that data set. So you can do things like create greater diagnostic tools for your doctors or nurses or whatever the use case may be. And there's a long way to go to get there, right? There's figuring out how agents work. There's understanding things like the model context protocol. There's figuring out how you can find the right vendors to deliver and help you consume sort of like an appliance-based model for an inference engine. I mean, I think enterprises they're not going to know how to do liquid cooling. They're not going to know InfiniBand. They're not going to know all that stuff. They're going to need like the VCE VBlock style, like roll in kind of like 5 to 10 racks, and the VBlock well, roll in 5 to 10 racks, that's basically tied to that sensitive data, and you're going to have your own internal inference platform while still using the external frontier models, which are going to be bleeding edge for forever. So you're hybrid from the get-go. So anyway, there's a long tirade, but I think things are going to be very, very interesting for the next few years.
Yeah, Randy, there's been a lot of articles lately about, are people actually getting the return on what they're putting in? Are they getting the productivity? We're coming up on 3 years since, ChatGPT first, came out to the general public. Most enterprises, as you said, don't necessarily have the skill sets or don't learn as fast to be able to take advantage. So, how do we make sure that the kind of trough of disillusionment in the hype cycle doesn't crash out this cycle? I think everybody agrees this is, could be one of the biggest cycles we've seen in decades. But, there are some concerns there about how real it is and how much benefit does the average enterprise get out of this?
I mean, I think that crossing the chasm this time is going to be just the way it was before. And it's really funny because I wrote up a byline for a journal earlier today, and we're literally hitting all the points just for somehow, not on purpose, but I guess because it's top of mind. But in the cloud native days and internet days, which were kind of the closest analogs in terms of sort of like broadly, technology that's sort of touching everything, every part of the stack. You cross the chasm by being smart, right? You didn't try to get AI and sprinkle it on. You don't want to get AI and try to sprinkle it on things like Magic Pixie does. You want to look very strategically at your application portfolio, what you're trying to accomplish as a business, and start working through it. You want to pick the easiest, lowest risk pieces first. You want to figure out how to deploy AI, whether it's agents or frontier models for that low-hanging fruit. And then you want to go to the next tier, and then the next tier, and the next tier. And in each stage, you want to basically bite off what you can chew, chew it, swallow, prove that you got value out of it, take the learnings and go to the next one. And it's just like slowly grinding away at stuff. I remember, kind of after Netflix made all the noise, kind of going to AWS and Adrian Cocroft started doing the rounds and talking to everybody. what I noticed was that the enterprises were starting to get a lot smarter about how they were going to use cloud. And what they did is they realized, rightly so, that trying to lift and shift kind of brownfield applications, existing applications, was not a great idea. The best idea was to go take greenfield applications, net new projects, where they wanted to go faster and they didn't want to have 2-3 years of kind of like waiting for IT to provision something, and so they could shorten their time to value on sort of the new projects and immediately deliver value on top of AWS and the other clouds. And then that proved out cloud for sort of the next step behind that. And then eventually some of those brownfield apps did make it onto cloud, right? But it's like it's the same thing, right? We need to kind of be very strategic about how we go about this. We need to be thoughtful. We need to do learning. We need to make sure that we don't go too big. Start small and build up.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground, Randy. What we have towards the end of this, we've got 3 rapid fire questions we're going to give you. We call it questions from a red hat. All right, Randy. First one, we talked about AI in the enterprise, but want to get personal here. How do you use AI in your everyday life?
Oh, okay. So I use it to do so-called vibe coding. I hate that. I prefer AI-assisted coding. But that's mostly just throwaway code. So when I was learning how to build agents, I was using Cloud Code for that. I also use it to help with running Kubernetes clusters, because I found that it's pretty good about that. Also, I'm just trying to really understand, because like it's very clear how you can apply AI tools to coding, and it's been less clear around ops. So I want to be kind of one of the people that figures that out and kind of understands what that looks like, because I think the focus is all on development right now, and ops is a little bit trickier place as well. I use, and for those, I use Cloud Code mostly. I also use ChatGPT quite a bit for research and brainstorming. I don't try to one-shot anything anymore. I go in with a plan, and I tell it the plan, and I basically manage it through the steps. And I have tried off and on to get it to write for me, and for blogs and things like that. But it doesn't do a very good job. It doesn't have my voice, even as much as I've tried to train it to have my voice. It just doesn't really understand how Randy thinks, and I have kind of a somewhat unique tone. But it's great for research. When I was trying to figure out who all the potential companies were in the world that could build their own sovereign AI factories, I was able to say, hey, go get the top countries with this, much GDP or above. Go get, the top 3 large businesses that were either telcos, data centers, or utility power providers. And basically, I gave it a whole bunch of criteria and kind of went back and forth and did all the deep research on me. So the research stuff is very, very helpful. And that's mostly what I use it for. Occasionally, I use it on the command line in Warp Terminal to do something, so I don't have to look it up. And that's actually been nice, because one of the things I've discovered is that I guess man pages I'm seriously dating myself, but I guess man pages have fallen out of favor, right? Like I install something with Brew and there's no man pages. And so it's a little bit annoying to try to remember kind of like all the parameters to like a given Unix, command line tool, and I can just have Warp do it for me, and I'll just double check it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the ops side. Reminds me of like one of the networking companies that you work for had been pushing out with what they called, self-driving networks. So, some of these things we think they're new, but it's building on all the automation things that we've had for a lot of years. All right. Second question for you, Randy. You're an advisor to a number of startups. You've worked with lots of startups. When it comes to emerging technology, what do you find is some of the biggest challenges that you find commonly with the companies you work with?
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, usually the startups are the ones that are doing the best job at adopting the emerging technology. Like you look right now, and there's a pretty big gap between startups and enterprises on AI usage. So I haven't really, most of the questions most of the things I have to deal with when I'm advising are more like go-to-market questions about how to get into the enterprise, what the sales motion looks like, how you talk to them when you're a startup. So believe it or not, even though I'm a technologist by trade and historically, I tend to actually help more with the business side of that of the equation, because they've usually got a pretty good handle on the new and emerging technology.
Well, no, yeah, and Randy, you totally answered the question there. It's not the tech; it's the how do you overcome the hurdles and the adoption and those things that we've been talking about. All right, last question for you, Randy. Again, a little bit of a personal one. You're in the process of moving, and when you're done with that, you will have lived in 3 continents. So, what do you look for when
Yep.
you're choosing, like, a region, a country, a place to live?
Oh gosh. I don't really think I look for anything, to be honest with you. It's not that I go where the wind sends me so much as that I'm comfortable feeling at home pretty much anywhere. Maybe it's been a life on the road, living on hotels sometimes, but I can be pretty comfortable just about anywhere. I'm pretty easy. I was asked this question by my project manager, and I told him, he asked, what do you need in a flat in Bratislava once you get there? And I said, well, the most important thing for me would be like a large screen TV. And after that, I don't really have many other requirements.
Solid internet, you know.
Solid internet. Yes, that'd be nice.
All right. Hey, Randy, looking forward to seeing you at the KubeCon show in Atlanta. Do you have any speaking things there? People to stop by the Mirantis booth? What should we be looking for you there?
I have not had a chance to look at that yet. I probably am going to get signed up to do some speaking. I'm going to be talking about agents, AI agents at Open Infra Summit. It's not exactly the best place for that kind of talk, but I have been really deep on them for the last 6 to 8 weeks, and so there's a bunch that I talk about that's really interesting. So I'll probably start talking about that, and then you'll probably see something fairly similar to that content at KubeCon.
Okay. Awesome. I will also be at the KubeCon Atlanta show. As I mentioned, OpenShift Commons, definitely be sure to check that out. Lots of great customers there. The Red Hat booth will be super easy to find. We're the first one where you walk in the door to that activity. And we've got tons of sessions. The link that we put in the chat earlier has all the details. So, Randy, it's a pleasure catching up with you. Good to talk through some of the waves of change. And we look forward to seeing you in Atlanta.
Awesome. Thanks, Stu.
All right, and we'll be back. Got another episode planned for us next month. Some of the latest updates as to what we've been doing on the OpenShift side. So be sure to join us then. And as always, thank you for joining us on your journey in the clouds.